Welcome to the second in our three-part National Forum series, Health, Biodiversity, Climate, A Path for a Livable Future. This session focused on biodiversity. Hi, I'm Jay Feldman, Executive Director, Beyond Pesticides. We all understand that life depends on a complex web of interrelationships in nature that we ignore at our peril. And because that is exactly what we've done, biodiversity collapse is now an existential crisis. In the United States, for example, our regulations do not consider the full extent of the harm to the food web that supports lower and higher forms of life. While EPA registered neonicotinoid pesticides, neonics, it did not and still does not consider the full impact of these systemic pesticides on pollinators and the vast array of organisms that are indiscriminately poisoned through pollen, nectar, guttation droplets, soil, and our nation's waterways at concentrations that exceed acute and chronic toxicity values for sensitive organisms. After their widespread use, EPA did conclude that seeds treated with neonics provide little or no overall benefits to soybean production. Moreover, EPA evaluates individual chemicals in a vacuum without assigning cost to all the costly externalities, lost pollination, lost ecosystem services, water pollution, health effects, and so on. The goal for today's seminar and beyond is to give us the tools to advance an urgent action agenda on the threat to biodiversity and the availability and economic viability of the organic land management alternative, a system of standards and management practices, allowed materials and inspection and certification. The global assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services linked on our forum webpage documents the urgency. According to the assessment, quote, the rate of global change in nature during the past 50 years is unprecedented in human history, end quote. The global assessment concluded that the necessary changes may only be achieved, quote, through transformative changes across economic, social, political, and technological factors, end quote. While there is a confluence of factors contributing to biodiversity collapse, our dependency on petroleum-based pesticides and fertilizers are a critical factor that, if eliminated, can mitigate and even reverse the problems. The conversation and strategic commitments require international collaboration, of which the United States has not been a part, having never ratified the International Convention on Biological Diversity. We can and must change this. Thank you for being here. We will extend the seminar today by 30 minutes. And at the end for Q&A, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen for questions. Now I'll introduce Dr. Terry Shistar, who will introduce our first speaker, Dr. Louis Garibaldi, who is a leader in addressing biodiversity and scientists worldwide. Dr. Shistar is an ecologist through and through. She has brought her deep sense of the whole of nature to Beyond Pesticides' strategic vision as a board member since its very beginnings, and now serves as Secretary of the Board of Directors. Terry.
Hi. In choosing the name Beyond Pesticides, we recognize that moving beyond pesticides means moving beyond pests. The division of organisms into good guys and bad guys, beneficials and pests, is an oversimplified and mistaken concept of the way the world works. It is also counterproductive in agriculture, parks and playing fields, other non-agricultural lands, and in general living on the earth, which means living with other organisms. An ecological community must include so-called pests as well as so-called beneficial species. Predators and parasites cannot live without their prey and hosts. Biodiversity includes genetic diversity, species diversity, and community diversity working together in a system that has evolved over time. Evolutionary biologists sometimes compare the removal of a species to the removal of a rivet holding an airplane together. So reducing biodiversity is not simply about reducing numbers. It is also about reducing the strength of the structure supporting the whole. As we know, cascading impacts of pesticide use on species diversity affect agricultural production through reduced pollination, as well as an imbalance producing overabundance of crop damaging species. For us, recognizing the importance of the diversity of life means promoting organic agriculture and land management, which depend on maintaining biodiversity and a balanced ecosystem. Our first speaker, Dr. Lucas Alejandro Garibaldi, is a member of the Secretariat for the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and a contributor to its landmark report, released with the United Nations Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Based on an unprecedented collection of evidence, the report outlines the global existential threat to biodiversity and collapse. Dr. Garibaldi is co-chair of the Transformative Change Assessment, which is charged with outlining the options for achieving the 2050 vision for biodiversity. Dr. Garibaldi studies agroecology, beekeeping, biodiversity, interactions between plants and insects, statistical models, and quantification of services and their contribution to human well-being. In his various teaching, research, and writing roles, he aims for ecological, social, and economic sustainability of agricultural and forestry systems. Dr. Garibaldi.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I will share my screen. Can you see my screen now?
We can, yeah.
Yeah, great. So I will talk about biodiversity and multifunctional landscapes. And first, I will focus on the problem that we are having with the loss of biodiversity as described at the beginning from the global IPBES report. So we can see here in the graph on the left that through time, we are losing species of all the groups. So amphibians, mammals, birds, reptiles, fishes. Year after year, we have less and less species. And the problem is even worse because those lines are not straight. They are kind of, they go upward. And that means that the rate of destruction is increasing. So not only we are losing species each year, but we are doing it at a faster rate. So there is an impressive urgent need to change the things that we are doing right now. And this is also related to the new IPBES assessment, which is called transformative change. So this global assessment that I'm showing you here, it was an assessment of 3 years from scientists all over the world. And we have found that to reverse these kind of trends, we need an important change, and we call it transformative change because it's a change in multiple dimensions, in the way we produce, in the way we move, in the way we govern ourselves, and in the way that we consume. And associated to this trend in the loss of biodiversity, we can see on the right side as an example, the increasing use of what we call in-farm external inputs. So external inputs are things that you usually buy and they come from outside the farm and they are consumed in the productive process. So you use them to produce things like fertilizers or pesticides, as is the example here. And you can see here that we are losing biodiversity and at an impressive rate. And at the same time, we are increasing the use of pesticides at the global level year after year. So the loss of biodiversity is not only a problem of the people who love biodiversity, it's a problem of all humanity because we live in a planet, we live in a planet that is governed by ecological principles, and the diversity of lives provides a lot of services, and we call them nature contributions to people. So, for example, regulating the quality of the water, regulating the quality of the air that we breathe, regulating the transmissions of diseases. Um, so all of these are called nature contributions to people. We classify the nature contributions to people into 18 contributions, and we have found that 14 of these 18 contributions to people that are critical to our survival in these planets have been decreased during the last 5 decades associated with the decrease in biodiversity. So this is a very important problem. And the other four contributions to people, they did not increase consistently, but we found different patterns according to the regions or according to the indicator that we choose. So overall, it is not a surprise that we did a very poor progress in the HE biodiversity target and the Sustainable Development Goals. Both are important agreements worldwide that we aim as a global society to achieve, and basically we failed. So as a summary, um, the impressive loss of biodiversity is associated to a decrease in the contributions of nature to people, and this is associated with the idea that the planet is losing its capacity to self-regulate and to sustain human life. So we can see our planet as this house. It's a house that previously it provided a lot of services to humankind, and nowadays these services are diminished or deteriorated. So the problem is very important, the problem is urgent, is big, and it implies changes from all the society and also affects all the society. So which are the solutions? There are many solutions to these kind of problems, and we need to do them in parallel or all together. I will focus here on what do we do with our rural landscapes and how we can change our current landscapes worldwide that look like this, homogeneous landscapes with very low biodiversity and using a lot of external inputs, including pesticides, into what we call multifunctional landscapes that they not only have crops, but we also need to have there and manage natural and semi-natural areas, native plants, edge, biological corridor, etc. And these multifunctional landscapes, they are based on more biodiversity and they use less external inputs, so the environmental footprint is much lower. And we call these multifunctional landscapes because they provide many benefits to society. So the previous landscapes, they are only focused on short-term crop productivity, and because of focusing only on one dimension of function within the ecosystem, they usually have problems or deteriorate all the other nature contributions to people that are also important for living. So in multifunctional landscape, we create landscapes that are all optimal in multiple dimensions. Landscapes that have clean water, clean air, food of quality that can help to regulate climate instead of generating climate change, etc. So this is an example of the things that we are doing in extensive agriculture. This is Argentina, but it could be Iowa or many other places where extensive agriculture is performed. So in the top left, you can see the traditional crop monocultures in big plots, square plots, and from the left to the right and from the top to the bottom, you can see how we are changing the landscape into first moving away from these squares that do not take into account the different type of soils and ecosystems that they are into the farm, first at a macro environmental perspective, then into a micro environmental perspective, adding crop diversity, but also adding, as you can see in 2022, biological corridors, adding service crops, and adding also reserves of natural and semi-natural areas. And an important aspect of this type of transformation, it is that it is a process. So this process does not end in 2022. It continues over the years, and year after year we increase diversity and we use less external inputs. So the farms are changed in a way that they become more regenerative. So the idea is that biodiversity can replace the services that these inputs provide, and it can even provide better services. For example, instead of buying a fertilizer, we improve soil quality and the diversity of animals within the soil through different agronomic techniques, of course. And in this way, we can create, as I said, farms that are regenerative. So, unfortunately, this idea of multifunctional landscapes is not mainstream worldwide. So, homogeneous landscape is the current situation most commonly all over the world, especially in the New World, which are the main countries that are producing food and managing landscapes worldwide. So why is this happening in this way? So we might think that homogeneous landscapes and this kind of industrialized agriculture, it has a high productivity or higher productivity per hectare. That means higher yields. And in contrast, in agriculture and in general farms that are based in diversity of plants and diversity of animals and less external inputs, they have less yields. So we test this idea all over the world during 5 years with real farmers in 33 places in the world. So in each one of these places or crop system, we have many farms. For example, in South Africa, you can see a blueprint there. We have many farms growing sunflowers. So half of the farm continue with the conventional system, and the other half of the farms implemented this pathway or this process into multifunctional landscape in a way to increase biodiversity and using less external inputs. And and we did the same, training farmers and discussing with them all over the world, as you see, mostly in developing countries where most of the food is produced, but also less of the science is produced. So we wanted to focus there. And we work again with real farmers and very different crops, from intensive crops to extensive crops, with family farmers, but also big agricultural companies with cotton, coffee, cocoa, etc. And here we focus on the biodiversity component on pollinators. So the idea is that the practice is increasing the diversity and abundance and pollinators. Pollinators are animals, mostly bees, but also butterflies and many other animals that visit the flowers and move pollen around and increase plant reproduction, and then it increases the number of seeds and fruits that we harvest. So in this experiment, we found the opposite trend, in a way that this multifunctional landscape had actually more yield, 24% more yield on average. Of course, for some crops it's a little bit more, for others it's a little bit less, but never it was lower. So we never found lower crop yield in multifunctional landscape than in a homogeneous landscape. So this is a very important result. And if we focus on pollinators, this photo gives a clear idea of why we are finding such an impressive trend of the need for pollinator diversity in crops all over the world. So you can see that we are creating this homogeneous landscape that they have millions and millions of flowers. So in this way, they demand a lot of pollen and a lot of pollinators. But at the same time, creating these industrialized landscapes, they destroy the habitat for pollinators. So there is no offer of pollinators and pollen. So as a result, we are finding a clear worldwide pattern of pollinator deficits because there is a lot of demand and little offer, and there is a window of huge opportunities to increase agricultural productivity with this multifunctional landscape that also provide pollinator diversity. And here's a graph that we can use as an example of how crop yield vary as a function of the number of pollinators that we have in a farm. But the important thing about this graph, that is a result of decades of studies and experiments in different places all over the world, including the USA, is that there is not only one function of the response of productivity with pollinator abundance or visit to the flowers, but you have different curves according to biodiversity. So you can see that if you have more species of pollinator in a community, it will be way more efficient in providing this contribution to humanity, and we will obtain more productivity. So biodiversity not only increase productivity at the short term, but also increase the stability of production. And you can see there that from left to right, from top to bottom, it increased the pollinator deficit associated to lower pollinator diversity. And you can see how the lack of diversity increase the instability of crop yields over the years. And this is an important aspect of the benefits of biodiversity in rural landscapes. So biodiversity in general, they stabilize the benefits that we obtain from these landscapes over the years. So not only increase the rate of provisioning of nature contributions to people, but also these contributions are more stable through time. And this is a very important aspect. And also, usually, we have productions of better quality, and so better quality of fruits, better quality of food in general. So maybe we have shown that this kind of landscape can be more productive. So maybe they are not mainstream because they are less profitable. And we did a review of this kind of studies, and we have found that on the contrary, per hectare, they have more profit, because on the one side, you have more production, so you have more income per hectare or per acre. And on the other side, you need to buy less things. You need to buy less pesticide, less fertilizer, so you have less cost. So as a result, your profits are greater. And we have studied in great detail these kind of things. So we work a lot with real data. So in our lab, we try to provide theory, tools, and data to try to increase and sustain this transformation from homogeneous landscapes into multifunctional landscapes. So when you go to the real farms and you work with the farmers and you are in the land, it is not only about general principles, but it's also about when, how much, where, these kind of concrete questions. So we, using data from our studies and from different parts of the world, we perform different economic models and also mathematical models in different papers. And we have found that one of the aspects of this multifunctional landscape, that is the restoration of natural and semi-natural habitats can be performed without losing profitability. Indeed, we found that most of the farms worldwide can restore as minimum 20% of natural habitats without losing money. And in this economic analysis, we took into account the opportunity cost, and we took a lot of economic aspects of the farms into account. And still we found that there are many ways and many opportunities to restore life within the farms without the agricultural enterprises losing money. And this natural habitat, of course, is not a magic number, but it is an important reference number. In many places, we actually found that we could even restore at 50% of the land without losing money. And of course, if we have governmental help and subsidies, this percentage can even be greater. And why is that? Well, on the wild side, these natural habitats, they provide many benefits, not only for the global society, but also for the farm itself. They are habitat, for example, for pollinators, but also in many areas of the farms, as you can see here in this photo, farmers are losing money because they are sowing crops in areas that are not very good for the crops. So for example, here in this photo, you can see these 3 corridors, and this is a highly a modern farm that they use the most novel techniques and everything, but still these 3 corridors were usually sown with different crops over 20 years, and they always lose money in these corridors because the amount of harvest was lower or even very similar to the cost that they implement to perform these sowings, the seeds that they need to buy, the machines that they need to go over these places. So there are a lot of opportunities within the farms to find areas to perform restoration. Still nowadays, despite all the technological advances, farmers are treating the land more homogeneously than the land it is itself in itself. And there are many areas where the farmers, they are losing money at a pixel level, and these areas are the first places to perform biological restoration. So are you listening me okay? Is the sound okay so far? Hello?
Yes, everything.
Thank you. So we have mapped all over the world which are the places that they need more urgently this restoration, and these are the ones that they have more red in the map. And you can see there a big part of the US, the Corn Belt especially, but also the main agricultural areas worldwide. And what we are saying is we are talking only about restoration. We are not saying if you go to a place, for example, that has 80% of forest, you need to cut down a lot of forest and leave only 20% of the forest. That's not what we are saying. Our work is not about that. What we are saying is that many of the farms all over the world, they have less than 20% of natural and semi-natural areas, and they could restore very easily up to a 20%. And this be very important not only for the farmer itself, but also for the society in general, because these natural and semi-natural areas, as I said at the beginning, they provide many benefits to humanity, and they are really needed. So if it is not from a productive point of view that there are no barriers to implement this multifunctional landscape, we don't have sometimes also important barriers from a profitability point of view. So which are the main barriers to implement these multifunctional landscapes? So there are many barriers, and of course they change from region to region. For example, in Argentina, most of the land that farmers use is rent, and it's rent over very short periods, so it's very difficult to perform these kind of plans and programs of multifunctional landscape that they are middle term, long term, in a land that you're going to rent only for 1 year or 2 years. But an important barrier that we are working on and we are trying to overcome is the lack of ecological knowledge. So uh, current farming is very simple. It's a very simple technological package in a way that is very intensive in the use of external input. You need to buy a lot of seeds, fertilizer, pesticides, and use a lot of fuel. But it's very low intensive in the use of local knowledge, local ecological knowledge to implement the agricultural practices. So it is performed in a simple, industrialized way, very similarly, despite some regions and landscapes are very different. On the contrary, this process of increasing biodiversity and using less external input is less intensive in the use of external input, but is way more intensive in the use of knowledge. It's more knowledge intensive, especially ecological knowledge. This is still is not rocket science, and we are doing far less that we could have been doing with our current knowledge. But still, most of the farmers or some of the agricultural enterprises, they don't know yet how to do things differently, and we are working with them in this kind of process in co-developing this kind of knowledge. Uh, so I want to mention another example of the benefits of natural areas within the farms. Before we said that we can restore natural areas and these natural areas, they can provide diversity of pollinators, but many other benefits. And here is an example of a very big region in Argentina. This is a province called Cordoba, and you can see the yellow points in the map in the lower left part of the slide. And in these points, we measure the water level, the water table, and you can see on the top part of the slide that through the years, the water was getting closer to the soil surface, despite some years this is a very long period, more than 40 years, so 50 years, sorry. So despite some years are more humid and other less humid, the water consistently was going up. And on the bottom right, you can see all these black circles, that these are new flutents that they weren't there before. So we are seeing a huge problem in many of the farms, that the farms are being now flooded. We have problems with salinization, etc. And this is because a very simple reason, and the reason is explained in this in the top part of this graph, that is the area cultivated on one of the department or the regions on this province. And you can see that during the 80s, half of the area was cultivated. But then in the 90s, we tried to cultivate and grow all the area, and we went up to 80% of the area, the total area. And then because of the flooding and the degradation, we lose 20% of the land. And it's important to recall this 20% of the land that we lose because of degradation, because previously I told you that we can restore 20% of the land without any cost. So without taking into account this, here we try to cultivate everything and we degrade our landscapes. And why is that? Is because a very simple reason, as I said before, because natural and semi-natural habitats, they cover the land permanently. So they pull out the water through transpiration from the soil into the atmosphere during the whole year. In contrast, when we grow crops, this happens only during a very short period of the year. So as a result, we are transpirating less water that it used to be. So the water started to accumulate, and we had new rivers, entire towns underwater, huge social problems and problems with the farm, and massive land degradation in an area that is big as Spain or or France. So this is an important example of a lack of planning at the landscape level and what could be the consequences. And below, despite Argentina is one of the most productive countries in terms of soybeans and maize and many other crops like sunflowers, you can see there the real yields for the farmers for maize in green and soybeans in orange through the years. And you can see that during the 90s, when the cropland expanded, the yields increased, but then they stagnate. So through conventional practices, we are not we are having a lot of problems in increasing crop yields of maize and soybean and many other crops. So on the one side, I'm showing you important problems related to conventional agriculture, not only for the society in general, but also for the farmers itself. And on the other side, I show you the big opportunities from incorporating ecological principles into agricultural production. And when we design these kind of multifunctional landscapes, as I told you before, we have to manage not only the crops, but also natural and semi-natural areas, as we discussed before. And I only mentioned two examples of nature contributions to people, pollination and water regulation, but of course, there are many more examples of the benefits of these natural and semi-natural areas. But because of time, I'm going to move on. We can also manage the edge of the habitats, the edge of the crops. And here you have an example in California. So the top photo shows you a conventional farming where you plug next to the road if necessary, and 5 years later at the bottom you see a nice edge with trees that provide habitat for pollinators and also provide biological pest control without competing for land with agriculture. Indeed, here the farmers are saving money because they need to use less pesticides, etc. This is another example from Iowa on how to manage edge. This is a soybean landscape. Sorry. And this landscape is managed to preserve 10% of natural and semi-natural area. And you can see here how the idea is to restore the prairies and this habitat restoration. It is providing a lot of benefits, especially in reducing soil erosion, which is a very, very important problem in Iowa. Indeed, we have performed a review of all the studies in soybean in terms of the dependency of soybean of pollinators. We have found that if we manage pollinators in a better way in soybean, the yield on average, again, can be improved by 21%. This 21% is very similar to the number that I showed you before, the 24% of yield increase. So these are really very important numbers. Of course, in designing these multifunctional landscape that are free of external input, or they have a very low use of external inputs, we need to manage in a different way the crop itself. And here we have an example of, we have several plots of sunflowers with conventional farming, which is represented by the picture below. And we have several crops that use less herbicides, and it's represented by the picture above. And you can see in the picture above that there are, of course, flowers from sunflower, but you can see there are also flowers from weeds. And these weeds, instead of reducing crop yield, they increase in crop yield because they become at a moment that it was not bad for the sunflower, and they attract a lot of pollinator into the sunflower yield. And in this way, we have more abundance and diversity of pollinator, and as a result, we have higher crop yield. And you can see that
5 minutes.
Thanks. You can see that in the graph that is in the bottom left, where crop yield of sunflower seeds increase with the number of species of weeds. So it's opposite to what you can think, that if you have more diversity of wheat, you have more harvest of seeds from sunflowers. But of course, you need to know how to manage this, because this is a different type of weed management, allowing some weeds during certain periods of the crops. So again, this repeats what I told you at the beginning about this idea of improving our ecological knowledge. Indeed, because of the impressive use of external input, especially herbicide, as I told you at the beginning, and at the beginning I focused on pesticide, but now I'm talking about herbicide. One of the huge problems of agriculture nowadays is that weeds are becoming resistant to herbicides, and these are the number of weeds that are becoming resistant to herbicides over time. And you can see that it's very impressive, and we are generating data and maps of the weeds, how they are increasing in resistance over the years for big regions of Argentina. And the idea that as another benefit of these landscapes, we describe pollination, water regulation, many other aspects, crop yield. But these landscapes also can be designed in a way that you have less weeds that are resistant to herbicides. So we measure weeds and how the landscape were in 5,000 farms in Argentina, in the graph that you see on the left. And you can see that there are two lines that go down, and this means for maize on the left and soybean on the right, that when you increase the number of edges, and we call that edge densities, the length of the edge in the landscapes, and this is represented by the three circles that you see below, from homogeneous landscape, from more complex, biodiverse, and multifunctional landscape, you have less weeds that are resistant to herbicide. So creating these landscapes provide benefits, again, to the farmers and to the society overall. You can see here another example of the things that we manage when we design these kind of landscapes. And you can see that here we measure 500 farms, sunflower yields, and you have two graphs, one that goes up. The one that goes up means that the farmers harvest more yield of sunflower in landscapes that are more heterogeneous, they have more edge density. And the other one that goes down, it means that they harvest less seeds of sunflower when the landscapes are more homogeneous. That means when the field sites are very, very big. These field sites that are very big, they disturb all the benefits of having complex landscapes, and they reduce the reduced crop yield. So I told you also that we create, so we are developing theory, tools, and data for try to design these multifunctional landscapes, and we are doing this with the mathematical and especially explicit models. Here you can see that we have different types of landscapes. And the two columns on the right, there are two maps of pollination. We can, with our models, we can predict the amount of pollen that each flower is going to receive at a very fine spatial scale. And this helps us to design again how much natural habitat do we need, where to locate it, what is going to be the consequence for pollination, not only for the crops, but also for the wild plants. And also these kind of maps, we can develop it with our models for other services. And here is another example. In the second row, you can see that everything is brown because it's mostly crop area. And in the third row, you can see that there is a 20% of green. For different examples in different places in the world, we have ecological principles and algorithms to help to design this more friendly landscape and how to assign habitat restoration. So this is very shortly to connect to this idea of multiple benefits to society and to humankind in general, and to move from one dimension, only crop in the short term, into landscape that provide multiple benefits to human beings. And here is a relation between the pollinator health, pollinator diversity, and human health. And we have found 4 benefits when these landscapes move from industrialized into more multifunctional landscape. This pollinator increase in health, and so we have better nutrition, more pollination. We have more medicines. There are more than 20,000 medicinal plants all over the world that depends on pollinators. We have a better mental health, and this is very important. There are many studies nowadays on these aspects. And pollinators are an indicator of environmental quality. So the quality of the water, the air, and the food also improve. Finally, my last example is about benefits beyond nature, benefits also, and beyond profits. There are many benefits for in human livelihoods, especially in employment. And on the bottom left, you can see in that circle a landscape that it has very low diversity, and where one crop dominates the cultivated area. And this idea is that this kind of landscape, they provide less jobs, they provide less employment, and also less external positive aspect to other economic activities like beekeeping or many others like tourists, etc. And working with many different countries, even the US, during many years, including data from technology, from jobs in the cities, in the rural area, etc., we have found that more diversity, this multifunctional landscape, they improve employment, and is a net effect of diversity that is not confounded with the incorporation of technology. So in this world where we have huge problem, a huge crisis of livelihoods and lack of employment, this multifunctional landscape can be a way in providing more jobs. Specifically, in 10,000 hectare industrialized landscapes, they provide 25 jobs, but multifunctional landscape, they provide on average, say, 6,700 jobs. And in many countries, so performing rural landscapes can be a very nice way to improve the environmental quality, but also the social and economical quality for human beings. So this is my last slide. Is kind of a summary of the things that we want to do if we want to transform this landscape at the city level, state level, or country level. So 1, enhance above and below ground species diversity. 2, reduce synthetic inputs. 3, enhance soil health. 4, maintain or restore natural and semi-natural areas. 5, protect and efficiently use water resources. 6, enhance habitat diversity. 7, integrate practices into a landscape design. 8, evaluate these contributions to people over the long term, not only short-term benefits. 9, consider in the evaluation the multiple benefits. And 10, this aspect of knowledge as a critical important thing to implement this multifunctional landscape, facilitate participatory action and farming training. Thank you very much. And I leave the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Wow, the amount of research you're doing is just incredible and really makes the case for that we shouldn't see any real barriers to transitioning. And solving this problem is within our reach, as we always say. So thank you for your work and thanks for making the time for us. I'm going to segue now to the next speaker. I'm going to introduce Dr. Liz Carlisle, who will introduce Dr. Bob Quinn, who is a force in the organic movement. Liz is a force herself and has teamed up with movement leaders to tell the organic story, first with her book, The Lentil Underground, Renegade Farmers and the Future of Food in America. As Liz says in the closing chapter of that book, quote, to build biological fertility is to build community, to accept interdependence with other creatures and foster a common benefit, end quote. Liz went on to co-author the book Grain by Grain with Bob Quinn, and in his dedication to, quote, these are your words, Bob, moving away from a commodity mentality in favor of products that explicitly assign value to soil quality, rural livelihoods, climate stability, and human health, end quote. Dr. Carlisle is now an assistant professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara in the Environmental Studies program, and just released her new book called Healing Grounds, Climate, Justice, and Deep Roots of Regenerative Farming. Thanks so much, Liz, for being here.
What a pleasure to be here, and what an inspiring conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Garibaldi. I totally agree that you have very convincingly made the case for a multifunctional agriculture as not only beneficial, not only viable, but really necessary. So thank you so much for your presentation. It's a total pleasure to get to introduce my friend and colleague and collaborator, Bob Quinn. I imagine many of you here today are very familiar with his work. He's been a leader in the organic community for upwards of 3 decades now. So thank you so much, Bob. And just for those of you who maybe don't know, I'll just quickly sketch Bob's journey in this work. He was born and raised on a family farm in Big Sandy, Montana, wheat and cattle ranch. And from his very earliest years, as I learned when we collaborated on the book, was deeply curious about science and loved plants and looked forward to the science fair every year. So no surprise, went on to a degree in science, went on for a master's degree, and then ultimately a biochemistry PhD at UC Davis in the early 70s. So you couldn't be better poised to go make a bunch of money in agribusiness than to come out of that very prestigious biochemistry program. But Bob had a very different view. He was really concerned about the turn towards relying on chemical tools in agriculture and the boom of synthetic fertilizer and synthetic pesticides and herbicides. And in returning to his family farm, he was also really concerned not only about what these chemicals were doing to the environment and to the quality of soil and the ability of farms to grow healthy food, but also what it was doing to his community. His immediate task, which turned out to be a challenge, was to figure out how to have a viable livelihood for 2 families on one farm in this get big or get out environment that went with this turn towards a chemical agriculture. And so in facing this challenge, Bob really saw the opportunity to learn about organic agriculture. He was a real leader in Montana in the 80s in converting his own family farm, teaching other farmers, helping to get a certification organization off the ground, and then ultimately serving on the first National Organic Standards Board to help actually create a national law with some teeth to enforce organic regulations and to broaden the conversation about, in fact, why we need to move beyond pesticides in agriculture. And he's just been a super inspiring leader in organic ever since. He's helped build a number of value-added businesses in his own home community to help, in fact, rebuild a rural economy where industrial agriculture had been hollowing it out. And at the same time, continuing to mentor other farmers, leading in organic organizations, where he's won a number of awards from the Organic Trade Association and Rodale. I'm sure just gave a really inspiring presentation at the 50th anniversary of IFOAM, which I've heard is IFOAM in the global north and IFOAM in the global south. So I'll pronounce it both ways today. But I'm sure we're going to hear a lot of really wise words from Bob Quinn today. So with no further ado, my friend Bob.
Well, thank you very much, Liz. That was surely a generous introduction. It's a thrill to be here, and it was a thrill to work with Liz. I can tell you all, the 3 or 4 months we spent putting together a book, and then the year and a half or so afterwards to get it published and take it around the country was just a joy. But I'm also thrilled today to be here with you Beyond Pesticides seminar. But first, I thought maybe I'd take you on a little tour of Montana, at least my corner of it. So, you know, how many of you have been up to north central Montana? But if I go outside my office, this is how I stay sane. I can look at, this is what I see. And so we have the Bear Paw Mountains about 3 or 4 miles away. And behind me is the Missouri River, another 3 or 4 miles. And in the middle of that is the prairie. And it's peaceful. And there aren't many people here. And agriculture is really king. But my concern, of course, has been how we do agriculture. And if there'll be anybody left to enjoy it except a few kings. And so that's been my challenge, to figure out how we can not preserve what we started with, but not how we can raise more, but how we can raise better. And when I think about, I appreciate so much the work of Beyond Pesticide folks. And you know, when you're going beyond pesticides, and we've already talked about it and heard about it this morning or today about what do you do next? And there's 2 different approaches that you can take. First of all, you can be against pesticides and just focus all your attention on being against the chemicals and the damage that they do and the health problems they create and all that sort of stuff. And that's we've been doing that for 30 or 40 years, and that's important. But I think that it's more fun, is for me. I've been on the against side for a while, and I'll tell you a story about that in a minute. But it's more fun to me to be on the for something. And to be for something that I wanted to promote is regenerative organic agriculture, which, by the way, doesn't need any pesticides. So you don't have to mention that right off the bat, but that's the secondary benefit that comes with it, which I think is quite important. And the health benefits that come with that I'm going to talk about, not only to your farm and your soil, but also the environment, to finally to the people that eat what is produced in agriculture. But let me share with you just a couple of quick stories of being on both sides of that question. When I was first converted to organic, and I was a full convert and passionate one, I'll tell you, in just a couple of years, I saw things happening on my farm that was changing for the better. And all the things that Lucas talked about with the yields and the increasing profitability, we saw on our farm. And it was very exciting for me. And so I was always in the state legislature with my friends there, trying to figure out how we can kind of stem the tide of big chemical businesses. And I didn't have any luck at all, I'll tell you, real frankly. When you go up against a battleship with a rowboat, it's a little bit of a challenge, and a pop gun or a cork gun, I should say. But I had a new idea once, about 20 years ago, that to approach the legislature with resolution that the state of Montana would ask their customers if they would buy more or pay more for production from a GMO-free state. And I thought, well, this is really reasonable, and how could you argue against just asking your customers what they want? We're not bad-mouthing GMOs and the chemicals that go with them or anything. But what happened when we got to the legislature, my friends, which I didn't have well coordinated, that was my fault about that. I didn't imagine what would happen. We're so used to the confrontation and the being against something that they all came to badmouth GMOs and all the pesticides that came with them in a very vocal way. And of course, Monsanto was there with their fancy lawyers and lobbyists from the best they had in the country. And it was just nothing but a big fight. And guess what? No one even mentioned my bill. My proposal was completely lost in the fray. And so the proposal that I thought was really a great idea wasn't even discussed. It was only a big fight between the industrial chemical guys and those that opposed them. So that went down the tube, and it was a little discouraging. But one thing that I had an experience, and Liz mentioned it here just last week, I was involved with the 50th anniversary, and here's the book from it, the 50th anniversary of IFOAM. IFOAM stands for International Federation of Organic Agricultural Movements. So it's kind of a mouthful, but it's been 50 years since they started. I wasn't there at the beginning, but I've been there for the last 3 decades, at least, as Liz mentioned, and I had a chance to join many friends, about 100 people gathered in Goshen, just south of Seoul, about 2 hours. And we celebrated the early days and the pioneers and what we have seen in the way of progress in organic agriculture throughout the world. And in conjunction with that was the opening of the 2022 IFOAM Goshen International Organic Fair. It was like a mini World's Fair. It was several acres of demonstrations of organic production and processors and farmers markets and farmers selling their goods and all that kind of stuff, as well as a lot of research demonstrations and a huge pavilion of the history of organic. I wish we could show that all over the world. It was very, very impressive and very enthused. Had a lot of enthusiasm that was created. One of the books I picked up there was The World of Organic Agriculture. And this is a statistics book that's put out by IPBES in Europe every year. And it catalogs the progress or the statistics involved in organic agriculture. And one of the things I think is quite interesting is the percent of land that is in agriculture production. If you look at Liechtenstein, of course, Liechtenstein is not a big country, it's about the size of Washington, DC, but 41% of Liechtenstein is organic now. Of course, it's small. But if you go up a notch or two to Austria, Austria has 27% of its land, agricultural land, is now organic. Austria is about the same size as Maine here in America, so that's pretty significant. If you go down to Germany, Germany is 10% organic. Germany is the same size as Montana. And so that's a pretty big area. We're kind of trailing along here in Montana, or in the US, at about 1%. We can barely make 1% yet, but at least it's going forward. If you look at the countries in the world that have the highest share of organic in the marketplace, we find Denmark is 13% of their market is organic. And Denmark is a country that's really focusing on getting organic in their schools and in their hospitals, which I'll mention a little bit more later. But if you go down to Germany again, they're about 6%. And that's about the same percent that we have here in America. We have way more production in our market, or sales in our marketplace, than we have production in our organic farms in America. So that gives you, that was quite a big enthusiasm for me, and shows you, even with all the naysayers and everything, we are really making progress, and we are on the way in the direction we should be going, I think. You know, but a lot of people don't understand really organic agriculture in itself, and what does it mean? And to me, organic agriculture, especially regenerative organic agriculture, is based on two main principles. that I'd like to share with you that I've seen on my farm. The first is soil building. And of course, we've heard a lot about that already, but soil building is really important to, that has been actually tried to be replaced with chemical fertilizers and a industrial model that you feed the plant. The organic, and you give the plant what it wants, and it's based on, everything's based on yield. So the more yield, the more you feed it, and on and on and on. You breed for that. Everything is focused on yield. In organic systems, we focus on the soil and feeding the soil. And once the soil is fed and alive and viable, it feeds the plants very well, thank you, and takes good care of it. And it doesn't matter what plants are growing there at all. The second principle that I think is really important is that of diversity. And if you look in nature anywhere in the world, in the seashore, in the lakes, in the forests, in the desert, even in the luscious growths, wherever you can find them, you won't find a monocrop or monoculture anywhere. Nature is built upon diversity. And I've always said, I think it's very true that diversity begets stability. And so the more diverse a system, whether it's a club you belong to, a community, but in this case, a farm, the more chance you have for success, the more stable is the system, and the more likely it's going to go from year to year and be sustainable and successful. We can't really grow, we can't duplicate everything or mimic nature on every field that we grow crops on. So we try to mimic that by rotations. So we have on our farm a 9-year rotation. So we have 9 different crops we grow over 9 different years if everything's working right. And those rotations don't allow us to have too many crops in the same field at the same time. But we, over the course of a decade, we have lots of different crops in those fields. And in that way, we can break up pest cycles, disease cycles, and weed cycles. And as Lucas mentioned earlier, our goal is not to eliminate those things. In fact, to have a little of them is a benefit. But what we do, so we don't talk about eliminating weeds, eliminating pests, we talk about managing. And we try to have a system where everything is helping each other. That's exactly what it works in nature. All the diversity is taking and giving back to the system so that you have, in the end, a stable system. A lot of time we hear the kind of the catchphrase, good soil produces healthy plants, and healthy plants produce, of course, healthy people. I'd like to expand on that just a little bit, and starting with good seed. You know, the other thing that's been a problem with the industrialization is our breeding programs, where they're focused strictly on yields and making more yields. And a lot of times, because of that focus, we have lost nutritional density in those crops. And it's not only because of the way we grow them, but it's the seed we're putting in the ground. So I think it's very important we start with seeds that are heirloom seeds, ancient seeds, or else products of modern plant breeding where nutrient density is just as important, or maybe the most important factor in the seed selection than the yields. Of course, they have to produce, but that shouldn't be the most important. The most important should be what that food does to us when we eat it, and the nutritional density that it carries with us. So I like to add to my little trilogy there that good seed plus healthy soil gives us healthy food, which produces in turn healthy communities. So it's really affecting the health of just not only the end people, but also the communities all along, the farms themselves, the farmers, the employment that we heard about already. All those factors are important to having a healthy community. So what are we doing in ag anyway? What are we doing? You know, when I got back to the farm, the only focus I ever heard was talk about commodities. We didn't even call it wheat. I mean, we were big wheat farmers, but and we're just average sizes in the community, but that's mostly what we did. And we never talked about it as wheat. We talked about it as a commodity, and we talked about commodity trade and commodity this, commodity that, as if we weren't even growing, anything else. And I've always liked to tell people in the last 30 years or so, since I converted to an organic, regenerative organic system, that I don't grow a single commodity on my farm, not a single one. All I grow on my farm is good food. and food that helps people sustain their health and their vitality, and is good for raising children and keeping our elders healthy and strong. And that's what I think I'm like to focus on, because when we think about growing food, it changes our attitude about what we're actually doing. And you know, if you take up a coin, here's a penny. So there's the Lincoln's on one side. It used to be the Lincoln Memorial was on the other. But on every coin, you always had one side and the other side. The one side I like to think of as production, agricultural production, and the other side is the quality or the type of food that we get out of that production. And they go hand in hand. You can't separate them. So if you have a production system that's based on just the best of industry has to offer, then what comes out of that on the other side is going to be the highest yield possible. If you have a diverse system based on soil health and organic principles, what comes out the other side is going to be a high nutrient density food. And I think that if you look at the results of what we have accomplished, so people brag all the time about the big yields and the amount of food that we have, but let's look at the health of our people. In America right now, 60% of the entire population, according to CDC numbers, these aren't mine coming out of the air, these are from the CDC, 60% of the entire population of America has at least one chronic disease, and 40% have two or more. To me, that's not a success story. People often talk about, and again, it's a little bit more later, about the high cost of food, of organic food, and how great it is that our food is so cheap. But they don't ever talk about how expensive it is to be sick, how expensive cancer is, how expensive diabetes is, how expensive all these chronic diseases that 60% of our country is plagued with. When we talk about food, we must always link it to health. And then we have a true picture of the cost that we're looking at. Right now, as I mentioned, in the beginning, or not in the beginning, right now we are at about 6%. Well, we're about 6% of our food now sold in the marketplace is organic. How do we get to 100%? If we get to 100% organic, then we are beyond pesticides. Guess what, folks? We are there. We are beyond them. If we have 100% organic food in our marketplace, and that's what's being grown in our farms and our ranches throughout the country. But how do we get there? One of the things I think is important is that, you know, we've seen the Ghostbuster movie for years. I think that we need some myth busters. Those people who stand up and bust the myths around. And the myths that people tell that discourage the idea that we can go organic. I really appreciate what Lucas had to say about yield and profits, because that is one of the biggest myths that there is, that organic cannot feed the world. And they always point to probably some poor organic beginning farmer whose yields aren't that great because he's just getting started. And I don't know where they get their numbers, but anyway, they don't jive with what we see in a lot of other research that's being done all over the world. Rodale is another good example of looking at yields and profitability, and what they're seeing is the same thing we've heard previously. Another way we can feed the world, and that's the chemical guys, the industrial model. This is what they brag about all the time, that they're the only way to feed the world. Well, there's a few other things, and they make some pretty stark graphs. They show you about the world population going up and food not keeping up with it, and starvation, and on and on and on. But there's a few things that we can do also besides worrying about organic systems. Organic systems can be a positive, as we already mentioned. But we know that we waste 40 to 50% of the entire production of food in this world. In the undeveloped countries, most of that loss and waste comes before the food gets to the processor or the grocery store or wherever it's used, because of lack of storage, proper storage and protection for the grain against pests and rodents and rain even. In the developed countries, most of that loss occurs after it gets to the processor. And a lot of it is happening right in your home refrigerator anyway, to tell the truth. That could be addressed. In both instances, it's one is developing a better infrastructure system, and the other is just changing our habits, the way we deal with our food, and have a little more appreciation for it and take care of it a little bit more. We could reduce the amount of grain fed to animals. There's a lot of grain fed to animals. We don't need to be feeding ruminants grain that were brought up on pastures historically. And the meat is much better on grass-fed anyway, from all the research that I've seen. So why not reduce what we are feeding to animals as far as grain goes? The other big myth that I'd like to just touch on is the expense of organic food. Because one of the things they always talk about is, well, the cost of what's in the grocery store now that's not organic, and then the cost of organic food that's in the grocery store, sometimes side by side. The trouble is that we don't consider the full cost. So this cheap food that we have comes with a very, very high price tag. And it starts with the farmers that are going out of business because they can't make any money selling their production at such low prices after having paid such big amounts for the inputs that we know is a big burden on farmers. And as a result of that system, about half of my neighbors in the last 40 years since I moved back to the farm are gone. They went out of business, they went broke. They can't make this system work. Because of their leaving the small communities, the little town of Big Sandy that I'm closest to, about 12 miles away, has gone from 1,000 down to 600 in population in the last 30 or 40 years. So that trickles down to the community. And then, of course, the cost of the environment, the cost of climate change, all that is almost uncalculable. And the final cost, of course, is to our health. And I've already touched on that. But that is, if you add all those costs together and add those to the price tag that you're paying at the checkout counter, nobody would buy that cheap food because it's not cheap at all. It surpasses the cost of organic food in a myriad of ways, and in a magnitude that would astonish most people if they really understood it and thought about it. But there is, of course, the increased value has to be paid for somehow. If you're going to be eating organic, if you're on a very limited income, how can you afford to be buying all organic stuff? I'll give you a few tips that I think that can really help. They can help anybody. One of I've already mentioned, and that's waste. If we're wasting half of our food, imagine if it costs twice as much, but we don't waste any of it, then we're back to zero. If we use it all, I mean, that means using the leftovers, using the cooking the peels in soup or whatever. I mean, there's lots of things that we can do to use that food and to have it stretch further. That's a real possibility. It could be done. The other thing is so that's reducing the waste part. The other thing is you can grow some of your own food. And if you were to have a little garden, even a few pots on the patio or something, a lot of towns have places where people can go and for little or nothing, get a little plot of ground that they can grow some vegetables. Anything that you grow yourself is going to reduce your costs of food. The other thing that goes along with that is to buy in season. And if you buy in season and then take the excess home and can it or dry it or preserve it or ferment it or pickle it, then you can have that food throughout the year that is much less than what you'll buy processed in the grocery stores. And then corollary to that is buying things that are not processed, buying whole potatoes, buying whole grain, and grinding the grain yourself, cooking up the potatoes and making your own baked potatoes rather than buying them frozen in the stores. You can save a lot with that. And if people need help with learning how to do that or providing kitchens where they can do their processing, I think that would be a very good use of government money and government support in ways that would increase food security and also the nutritional value of what we actually eat. So those are just a few things that we can do to reduce costs and to eat better. On the other side of that eating coin is the production side. And as I mentioned already, American farmers are only about 1% of the total, and yet the marketplace is 6%. So of course, there's a lot of food being imported right now that American farmers could take advantage of growing it right here and then reducing our pesticide load. You know, people don't think about this sometimes, but for every acre converted to organic is 1 acre more that's not having any chemicals put on it or poisons put on it or into the atmosphere. It's a 1-for-1 exchange. It's worth working for. So why aren't more farmers converting? When I asked my neighbors, you know, when I first converted, they thought I was crazy. They thought I'd been in California too long. And most were taking bets at the coffee shop. Well, is he going to come to his senses and come back to, you know, the traditional agricultural, conventional stuff, or is he going to go broke first? Those were the bets. No one imagined that it would be successful. And when it was successful, they said, well, he's got a PhD. Well, you don't need a PhD to be successful in agriculture. All you need is a little different management approach and not buy into the high cost of industrial chemical agriculture. But you do need a little help and encouragement and some educational opportunities. And Lucas also referred to that. One of the things that I see as a kind of a roadblock or a discouraging point is the lack of research in solving some of the problems that come with, at least in Montana and the upper Great Plains, with organic farming. One of the challenges we have is perennial weeds. And they've been getting worse and worse, and some organic farmers have just given up. And certain weeds are very, very difficult to manage. If we had the kind of research dedication that we have with USD that we have for chemical agriculture, we would have some of those problems solved in not too long a time. Thankfully, that is increasing, but we're still up to only about 1% or so of USDA's funding. It may be a little bit more now with recent additions that have been announced, but still, I think that it's not too much to ask USDA to at least equal the amount being sold in the marketplace. That would be 6%. Imagine if 6% of the USDA budget were focused on research for organic systems, because the beauty of it is that a lot of that research can be used by non-organic farmers if they just want to, put their toe in the water and reduce their chemical dependency. And there's a lot of interest in that now with the extreme high cost of chemicals over the last year or so. They've gone up enormously. And in fact, we've seen a big reduction in Roundup use, for example, here not only because of the drought we've had, but also because of the cost of it. So research by definition should be looking forward and helping people progress into what's coming, not following behind and looking at where we already are. And that's what we're kind of stuck in. Of course, there's a lot of influence trying to keep those dollars for the chemical guys and selling their stuff. The other thing, even the language we use, I talked about commodities and how we shouldn't talk about commodities, we should talk about food. But another thing that was kind of a pet peeve of mine is the reference of the non-organic guys, the chemical guys, as conventional farmers. Well, when I look at conventional agriculture, I look at what we've been doing the last 10,000 years. That's conventional in my mind. What we have in the last 50 or 60 years is a great grand agricultural experiment based on an industrial model of chemicals and poisons and focused on trying to get more and more yield, more and more out of the same ground year after year after year without putting anything back into it. That model is as a bus, it's where the wheels are coming off all over. Lucas mentioned some of it on resistant weeds to pesticides, but also we have climate change. We have Roundup in our rain, for heaven's sakes, and it's falling on our farm in minute amounts, to be sure, but still we've used so much of that chemical. It's everywhere. It's pervasive. It's in our groundwater everywhere. It's in our rainwater. It's in our soils, and it's time to consider the direction we're going and take another turn. So in conclusion, I'd like to dream a little bit. And so I sent a slide to Jay to share with you. This is a picture of going from 6% of organic food in the marketplace to 100%. So I think he's getting it up now. And I put that together using the current rate of growth, which is averaged over the past, well, I hope you can see that. It's kind of half and half on my screen. But anyway, there it goes. Good. Okay. So at about 8% annual growth in organic sales for the next 34 years, that will bring us to 100% by 2056. We already heard some words about some of the things we're hoping for by 2050. This could be just another one of those goals. And 8% isn't that great. We're over that now with the pandemic pushing it well into the teens. That probably won't be sustainable, but 8% could be sustainable. And how can we reach that? This is something, folks, that everybody can be a part of. You don't have to be out marching in the streets or even writing any letters, although that's good too. But you can help reach this by going to the grocery store and filling your basket with just one more item or two of organic products every single time you visit. And encourage your friends to do the same thing. And asking when you go out to the restaurants if they have what's organic on the menu. You don't have to make a big stink about it, but let them know that you're willing to order and pay for the organic stuff that's there in the restaurant if they would carry it. That's what we have to do, folks. We have to be a part of the change that we want to see. And if we are, then we can see that change happen faster and be more sure of its coming. So my challenge to all of you is to be part of that solution. You know, the folks that in my generation that spent the last 30 years going from 0 to 6% in America, that was quite a challenge. And now it's the goal and the opportunity for the next generation, or maybe it's the next generation and a half, to who's ever left out there, to finish that job. We opened the door in the last 30 years, and now it's time to walk through that door and to finish the job. And that's my invitation to you and my encouragement, and thanks to you all for doing it. And thank you for the time today to share some of my thoughts. And I look forward to any questions you might have. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Bob. Wow, yes, that's the challenge. And thanks for putting it out there, because I think we are finished tinkering with broken systems. We need to build the organic system. And so thank you again for that. We are going to take questions, but before we do that, I wanted to introduce to you our board chair, Paula Dinnerstein. And she is general counsel at the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. You've heard of the organization PEER that represents whistleblowers. Prior to joining PEER, though, Paula worked for a law firm that did incredible work for Beyond Pesticides in our effort to ban chlordane, the DDT family of chlordane, which was widely used. Bob, you probably remember this on the farm in agriculture. And it was sort of a general use insecticide, then was banned for use in the era of Rachel Carson, and then remained in use as a termiticide, which we were concerned about. So Paula led the charge on that in the courtroom, did a phenomenal job. Eventually, it did get removed from the market. And the same thing with wood preservatives. It's been a long struggle to remove hazardous wood preservatives, and all along the way, advance alternative practices and materials. So Paula, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So I just wanted to say that I actually have been on the board of Beyond Pesticides since 2006, and just recently became the chair when Reigart decided to move from the chair to the board. So he's still very much with us as a board member, and I am taking over as the chair, and really happy to continue to be part of this, which I have been, since 2006 in a new role, and to be part of presentations like today, which were really impressive, putting forth Beyond Pesticides mission as, not just being, as was discussed, against pesticides, but for the transformation that will really save our health and our planet, as the alternative to pesticides, being organic production on farms and organic land management elsewhere. So thanks everybody for coming today, and we'll go on to the question and answers now.
Yes, thank you. We have some interesting questions, and you guys as speakers can see the questions that have come in through the Q&A. I wanted to start, we'll sort of go in order here. The questions at the beginning are for you, Lucas. The first one being in South America, is there government support for making the transition to more biodiverse, multifunctional landscapes?
Well, it varies among countries. There are many countries in South America. So the short answer is no. But of course, there are many local initiatives and side national initiatives also to try to promote these things. Of course, there is always some programs that you can apply, etc., but it is not mainstream at all. So there is, in general, in South America, there is no support, but of course there is a lot of heterogeneity.
Yeah. In the US, we have, in the US, we have support for transition to organic, cost share program that really should be something we elevate, not only make it bigger in the US, we did pump a few more dollars into it, but create a worldwide fund to assist in the transition. That we all, from your speech really, your talk really shows clearly, which I think we often miss in the US, how this challenge is really an international challenge, and that we have to solve this problem together internationally. So I don't know if any of the venues you work with, if you could envision through the UN or UNEP or some of the other international bodies, a vehicle, maybe IFOAM has something like this that could be cultivated to bring the resources necessary to help with the conversion.
Yeah, so related to what you said and the first question, what it happens in many developing countries is that usually agriculture is one of the main sources of income and exportation. And it happens something similar to what the neighbors of Bob said or thought, that the only way of having an income or import is through conventional agriculture. So not only the farmers do not have incentive to change, but also the governments, they depend a lot on the income from agriculture. So they are frightened that if there is some change into more organic, they are going to have less income and produce less. So it's a similar reasons to reasoning to both neighbors, and this is also a barrier. Indeed, in many countries, for example, in Argentina, 70% of the income from exports come from agriculture, 70%. And this is a huge number. And most of the farmers are not subsidized, are taxed. So they have important taxes. And so agriculture in many of these countries is the first source of employment and income. Paradoxically, what the governments are not seeing is that they are losing a lot of employments because of industrialized agriculture, and this has a huge social cost. And they need to put a lot of money into social programs to try to cope with these huge social costs of losing employment because of this industrialized way of doing agriculture. And also it's also related to what Bob mentioned about the cost also of health. And so actually I think the governments are not seeing very well the picture somehow, to say it in a short phrase.
So this, I think, Bob, you know, your experience maybe can help us inform an answer to this in terms of corporate influence and the degree to which that corporate influence holds, you know, influences our politics, how we educate, and our culture. You've created a market niche, and a growing one. Obviously, you've been a part of it since its infancy. How have you managed around those corporate roadblocks, and how do you have a vision for how we would overcome corporate influence in terms of protecting their own vested economic interests? You're muted, Bob. Bob.
There you go. There you go. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm on you muted. Okay. That's a very good question, I was going to say, because the folks that are in power don't want to see anything changed. And we didn't get into big pharma, but they're just a part of this mix now too. And nobody wants any of that changed. And they have enormous resources to make sure that it doesn't change in very much in policy, and certainly in programs that would discourage people from continuing on the way they're doing with them. So what I think we need to do is kind of go around to the back door. And the back door is what I mentioned about our customers, the people who are eating food. When you have 60% of the people who are sick, there's a lot of those people that are looking for solutions. And a lot of those solutions, particularly for chronic disease, is organic food. It doesn't fix everything for everybody, but it fixes a lot for a lot of people. And if we start to make that known, and we can talk and promote that a lot, and some doctors are starting to do it now. Why don't we have just move by inches, like allowing prescriptions for food to be part of Medicaid, Medicare, and all this other stuff that's supported by government subsidies. Why don't we have prescriptions for food also become as important as prescriptions for pills, for example? But also, I think just in getting organic food into into schools and into hospitals. Some hospitals are converting to that, even in America. There's a lot more interest in that in Europe, and they're starting to see increased response of the patients. Those are the kinds of things. If you look at the low-hanging fruit, the people who are most sensitive and most affected by chemicals, if you can get them onto organic food and off of chemically tainted food, I think that could be a big opportunity for telling our story and maybe creating more interest in it. That
Yeah.
takes longer. We don't have the billions of dollars that the chemical guys do. We have to do it differently. We have to do it smarter, but we're on the winning side because we have the results. I mean, the results are better health. Results are better stability in our communities. I mean, those are a little slower to come. Those are the things I think we need to talk about and be part of that, be part of that solution.
Well, we all know that Wendell Berry said that eating is an agricultural act.
That's right.
You know, it's also a political act in many ways.
Yes.
And so your suggestion that we all hold that power in our hands at the grocery store, and if we could encourage just that additional purchase, you know, in the realm of organic, we could make a lot of progress and see that growth. You mentioned, Lucas, you mentioned pixel farming, and there was a question about asking for a greater explanation on what that is exactly.
Well, it is an invented term, but it means that the land is more heterogeneous, that we are currently taking into account into management. So in this aspect, being more precise with precision agriculture, not necessarily big machines, can help us a lot to try to better understand and better manage the heterogeneity that we have in our farms to create these multifunctional landscapes. We also have, I did not have the time, but sometimes with the same area of cropland, but just distributed in a different way, you have a more complex landscapes, growing crops in rows, or there are many ways to create this multifunctional landscape. But it meant a little bit mostly that, yeah.
One sticking with the South, in your work around the globe and in South America, are there bright spots of organic? I know you mentioned some, Bob, but Lucas, in your work, do you see that growing as in specific countries that stand out for you?
Yeah. Again, it's very difficult to make a generalization for all South America, but in general, it's growing, and especially because we export a lot of food, and by the changes also in preferences in more developed countries into more organic foods, that also force us to change. And there are a lot of market opportunities for organic, and also other related as ways to do agriculture, like the biodynamic, so what we see is that there is an increase in the positive examples. So you can go now almost everywhere and see a farm that is doing things in a more environmental friendly way, that is profitable, it is living in the real world, and it has people there is more healthy and happier. But despite that, nowadays we have these real positive examples on land, and that is very good. So we are more advanced somehow. The rate of destruction is much higher, so the balance is quite negative. So the positive examples are increasing, but the rate of destruction is increasing at a much faster rate. So somehow the balance is still quite negative. So that is the situation right now.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting in looking and, you know, as we track agriculture and transition and a lot of the data that you both are sharing, you realize there are a lot of terms that have been used. When I first got into all of this back in the 70s, the buzzword was integrated pest management, and many academics saw that as the savior, you know, for the future, that we would, instead of prophylactic chemical use, we would actually make a determination not on management practices necessarily, but when to apply the pesticide ultimately is how it worked out. So I'm curious, I know, Lucas, you're part of the agroecology movement. which seems to bring in more issues around social dynamics, issues around culture, and integrates that into questions of land management. Organic, on the flip side, does less of that. We'd like to see more of that. We'd like to see, I think I would like to see more of that integrated into standards around organic. But organic, nevertheless, is a standard that's measurable, identifies allowable inputs, and has an inspection and certification system. Do you, now, my last point here is now we're seeing regenerative as a term being used separate and apart from both agroecology and organic as a new wave of, thinking. And I'm just wondering, Bob, how you see this, having worked so hard to create a standard and a system around soil health and management practices that have become integrated as part of a standard and a seal that people can rely on.
Well, that is also a good question. The problem I see is that regenerative has no fixed definition. So whichever group you're talking to, you're going to get a little different definition with what regenerative means. If you hook it to something like agroecology or organic, particularly with organic having a definition, then you know exactly what you're talking about. Some of my biggest critics criticize organic. The regenerative guys that are criticizing organic are bragging about, all they can brag about is no-till and not disturbing their ground. And that's the only thing they focus on. And meanwhile, they're using just a little, they say, or a little less Roundup than they used to use. So, and I'm all for anybody that can reduce their chemical load, whatever they're doing. But I say to my friends in that camp, I said, don't stop there. Keep on going until you can get to zero chemical load, and join your regenerative ideas with the organic ideas. And I say the same to my organic friends. I said, don't get hooked on an industrial input system that's going to just replace a chemical input system, and focus more about feeding your plants again and going back to unsustainable monoculture that's organic because we're using organic inputs.
Right.
I see that as a little bit of a danger. So I really like the idea of combining both of those terms, because you can avoid both of those problems. If we would, and some people and some certification groups are doing that already, and I take my hat off to them. I think that they're going a long way of solving some of that confusion and helping to bring it into a solution we can all benefit from. Yeah.
This has been a perennial issue at the National Organic Standards Board in the United States, where, we've got petitioners of materials, of products as inputs, and many of those inputs are a function of industrial agriculture. They're needed in an industrial system. What you've done, Lucas, is to work with some pretty big farms there, integrating corridors and different elements that are integral to a biological system, really, that feed the biological, whether you're talking about edges or corridors. But in either case, aren't you asking industrial farmers essentially to take land out of production? And how do you convince them to do that? Is it your research where you show them the facts that it's contributing to productivity, or what is it that helps them, or their failure to adequately control a pest? How do you make that transition in industrial ag?
Well, it is a process. So, and in that way, it is an inclusive process. So it is like you want to start running, and so you start little by little, and we try to do the same, so we put objectives year after year of increasing biodiversity and reducing external inputs, and different enterprises can go at different rates in that process of transition. So not all of them need to go at the same rate of change. So in that way, the agricultural enterprise is always making a profit, and it's always growing, and it's always changing in a way. And sometimes the things that we think are more innovative, you test them in a smaller surface of the area of the farm, and then when it works, you expand them. So I think that people react negatively when you talk from a dualistic point of view, this on the other, and you need to change everything. So they see it too far away. It's like if you never run, you need to run tomorrow 40 kilometers, and then the next day you are dead. Or you need to start, okay, one day 2 kilometers, you enjoy it, and you move from there. So and it's a process that you can always improve, because if you are already a person that is fit and is running, you can always run better in shorter times, these kind of things. So in that way, we emphasize in the process, and it is inclusive. And that's why I focus also my work in biodiversity and external inputs, because it focuses more on the things that we need to do on land, and it takes out all the confusions of terms that Bob was mentioning about regenerative or these kind of things, and we focus more on the concrete things that we want to change, at least from an environmental point of view. And the other thing that nowadays the farmers are more open to our views. So 10 years ago, they listened to me and said, okay, very nice, Lucas, have a good day, bye-bye. And now they listen and they say, okay, how can I start to change? Which are the things that can I do? And in 10 years or 15 years, it was a change in the interest, I think, mainly because of a few things that are very clear. First, they see the degradation of their own system, because they see that they need to apply way more herbicides. The profitability is being lower than used to be. So they see that. They are not telling this to everybody, but but they clearly see it associated also to land degradation. Second, they also see the social pressure in many areas. 50 years ago, the sector was kind of we are the farmers, we have biodiversity, and we provide food to humanity. And nowadays, people see them as enterprises that are contaminating the land, and they are generating a lot of social problems. So they feel also the social pressure somehow. Some enterprises feel more this than others. And third, associated with the second point, is that they are seeing also the change in the markets. So they are seeing that things are coming differently. And most of them nowadays are more focused on being carbon neutral, but this is kind of a door, an open door to also to discuss other things about using less external inputs and more biodiversity and more of these kind of things. But so these are positive trends. But again, as I said from my first slide of the IPBES assessment, the balance still is quite negative, and it is getting worse. So we should not rest. We should move faster and change faster.
One of the questions, I don't know if you saw this one, is something we hear about all the time, and that is the burden in an organic system, because it is a standardized system with a seal and a certification inspection, that the burden on the farmer is costly, especially when it comes to record keeping. Aside from the issues around inputs or changes in practices and the 3-year transition, there is the onerous record keeping. Do you hear that, Bob, a lot in your travels?
Yes.
And have you struggled with that in a way that you can, because we've talked about alternatives to create more efficiency. doing away with record keeping wouldn't really solve the problem in terms of consumer accountability, maybe, but.
Well, and also in farm management, you need to keep good records to figure out what's going on and how to respond to it. But the kind of records that are asked of the organic folks, in addition to just normal field records, are, you know, when did you clean out your truck and your combine, and document all this stuff from crop to crop. It's more serious, I should say, when you have a split operation of organic and non-organic. That really is complicated, is more complicated. And of course, an easy solution to that is just to continue to transition to organic, and so you don't have a split operation. But that sometimes takes time. What I see traveling around the world in a lot of different countries that are set up, where their agriculture is set up differently, they have more cooperatives, and they have a different type of record keeping or certification process that is much more simplified. And I think that could go a long way. If we had ways to maybe have a little bit of each, help from both sides toward the middle, I think that would be a big advantage. And don't get caught up so much in the details of certification and the complexities of it. I'm looking forward to the day when we won't have to be certified, but the chemical users will have to be permitted somehow to use just one more chemical, and they have to keep all the records, because that's what's, you know, a big question mark. But we're a little ways away from that. But I don't mind asking the other side of the question and looking at that too.
No, that's a really good point. I mean, part of the problem and the burden is really defined by the lack of information available in the chemical intensive systems.
Yeah.
The lack of record keeping around chemical use and, you know, all that. So it's, you know, it's sort of a question of whether we have accountability, but as you say, it's also good common practice in terms of making good decisions down the road on
for a certain amount of that, yes. And also what we see is with more focus on regional production, and the closer you can get to your markets where the people know you, the certification is the first thing to go if you're doing community stuff where everybody knows you and knows what you're doing. They don't need to see a certificate saying that you're following all the rules. They know if you are or not. And so I see a lot of my friends that are doing mostly local markets. Some are involved in certification, some are not. But I think that could be an advantage of more regional or more local production, where we actually know our farmers again, and the farmers know their customers, and there's a trust built. The certification is really for a trust element, particularly when you're selling out of the state or into different regions where nobody knows you. And it's a way to create a level of trust where we can say, okay, well, I can count on this food as being legit, because it's illegal and you can go to jail for lying about it. And if that has proven quite helpful, I think.
Yeah. Your point about nutritional quality, also, there was somebody on the seminar with the International Confederation of Dietetic Associations, and she is working to coordinate a sustainable food systems toolkit. So, and we do have a member of our board who you may know, Melinda Himmelgarn, who is very active as a registered dietitian in trying to link the food issues around nutrition and health with organic. So I think people, that resonates, your comment on that resonates. And I know your history, Bob, in, you know, some of the ancestral wheats and, you know, educating people as to the value of whole grains and so forth is a part of that. I think one commenter suggested that we need to do a better job of documenting that nutritional value. So any papers or documents you can share, we'll post on that. And I know we do cover the literature and see that from time to time. but are you seeing more interest? You mentioned the medical community. I know the American Academy of Pediatrics has recommended organic as a way of reducing exposure in children. There's been connections made with chemical exposure and autism in kids. So there is more and more. Are you seeing that discussion more out there, Bob?
Yes, I am. And I think, and we talked a little bit about this before too, what we need is not only the focus on the damage the chemicals do, but the lack of help that low nutrient density does. So if you have a high nutrient density diet, you're more able to resist all kinds of stress assaults. And the chemical is probably one of the larger stress assaults on your system. And if you are, that assault's going to be worse if you're eating a low nutrient density diet. And if you're eating a diet that's low density and with the chemical contamination, it's like a double whammy. And you can eliminate both of those. You can eliminate the bad stuff and increase the good stuff by going to organic. Now, what we really need is a easy test. And a lot of our research you mentioned about, we've published 35 peer-reviewed journal articles on comparing ancient wheat with modern wheat with our Canute studies in Italy. Most of those studies were organic compared to organic because we didn't want to introduce that variable. But what we found, the biggest difference was inflammation was reduced. And I've seen a couple of studies where that same thing has been shown and antioxidant capacity is increased. Those same things has been shown comparing organic and non-organic. And what's going on with the organic production is it's more polyphenols oftentimes in organic production. If a plant is bitten by a bug, it produces polyphenols to protect itself. And some of those protection compounds are also protective to us and help our immune system. And what we need is I think as a inflammatory index where you could easily test the anti-inflammatory levels or the inflammatory levels of different foods raised in different systems or even processed differently. That also is a factor, how we process things and the additives we add to them. All those things go into the final formula of what we eat. And if we could focus on something like inflammation and use the living system somehow to test for it rather than just some chemical test tube test, I think it would be a huge game changer in the world of plant breeding, in the world of processing, and then certainly in the world of agriculture.
Yeah. Well, you both have given us a lot to think about. And again, we want to continue this conversation because what we're talking about here is not just a question of tinkering with a broken system, but really transformative change. And I know, Lucas, you are very engaged in transformative change with your cohorts internationally. And so we'll be watching the work you do in that arena through IPBES as well. And so I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for not only showing up today and giving of your time, but for what you continue to do. It is really life-changing and life-supporting and life-sustaining, which is what we all need if we're going to make it through these existential crises. So thank you so much. We will be in touch and we'll be following up with distribution of your presentations throughout our networks and hopefully through your networks as well. So thank you, and thanks to all who participated today.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.